Hello and welcome back to David's Closet. On this channel we talk about handbags, accessories, small leather goods, and lifestyle on a budget and from the male point of view. So if that's something that's interesting to you, please subscribe to my channel. I'm working to grow this channel. You guys have heard me say that a lot. I am doing another cooking vlog, but unlike my cake video, this one will be much better because this video actually is a homemade recipe. So this is my homemade apple pie. So this is my grandmother's recipe on my dad's side. Really, really good. I did make a few alterations to it, which I will point out as we go. She gave me a handwritten recipe card. I have it laminated kind of to keep it safe. So I love this recipe for that reason, and it's just really delicious. So while we're here talking, I have my oven preheating to 425, and I have all these glorious ingredients set out in front of me. It might help if I turn on the light. I usually start with making the filling first, and then I make the topping. So we will go ahead and do that. So the first thing I need to do is get my apples peeled. So the recipe calls for 4 or more, depending on the size, tart apples. So my grandma told me Jonathan apples, I believe, is what she usually uses. It's really hard to find those sometimes. And as anyone who's worked with apples before, also my audio, this is a new device from my husband, so I don't know if it's working. Anyway, some apples are more watery than others, so sometimes it's hard because I don't want my apple pie to be really wet. So I always try to play around with what apples I buy. This time I could get my hands on some Granny Smith apples, and then I have a couple Fiji apples. I always do 4 tart apples and then 1 sweeter apple. I also like to do Honeycrisp for the sweet apple, but it's whatever I can get my hands on. Thank you, Evan. I also don't make this recipe in double batches. A handful of times I've tried that, it just hasn't quite turned out, and I know it doesn't make sense, so I always make them separately. I actually made one last night for Thanksgiving, and then the day after Thanksgiving, I was invited to a brunch at my aunt's house, so I'm making one for that as well. And also excuse my dish rack. I tried to clean it out before, but I don't have time. So the rest of the video, you're only going to see my bottom half because I want you to kind of see what I'm doing, but I will definitely let you know what's up. I use a vegetable peeler. I think it's the easiest way. And then I just set down a sheet of wax paper. If I have like a cardboard box I'm getting rid of or anything, I'll use that for the scrap catcher just to eliminate a little bit of mess. And then I just peel around the apple. When I first started making this recipe, it was a mess because I hate peeling apples. But now I can almost do the whole apple in one swoop, which is good. Just kind of pull this out of the way for now. My apples are all good to go. I'm going to grab my little cutting board and a knife. And my favorite bowl, I got it at the Pioneer Women's Store in Oklahoma. I'm going to set that there. And then I'm just going to cut the apples off of the core. It's okay if you get a little bit of the crunchy core because, again, it's going to bake and it will be fine. Now, again, depending on the apple is how thick you need to cut it. I usually cut it about that thickness for the tart apples because these apples will hold up a little bit better. I do like to do a little bit of varying size because, you know, some apples mush and turn into applesauce, which is not my favorite, and it does make me sad. But you just really have no idea what's going to happen in the oven. So I just try to cut them all consistently, but I do a couple bigger, a couple smaller, things of that nature. Here's the apples. Go ahead and toss them together, blend them all together, make sure they're all pulled apart, because when I put it in the pie, I don't want, you know, 2 pieces to have all the Fiji apples. Here's where I deviate from my grandma's recipe. I use a little bit of cornstarch, and I don't measure it. I just kind of sprinkle it over the apples as they are. Probably a couple teaspoons. And then again, I just want to get them nice and coated because when they start to sweat and, you know, kind of release some of their liquids, this should help it kind of turn into a jelly versus a watery mess, which I have had happen several times and it makes me sad. So the next ingredient, the recipe calls for 1/2 cup of sugar. I do like to do a little bit more than that. So I do about 3/4 of a cup. These are 4th cup measures. So 1, 2, here's my extra. And then it's a pie. So I'm going to do another teaspoon or so. You know, I want this to be sweet. I'm not making a pie to be savory. And then now sugar. The recipe calls for 1 teaspoon. Okay, that's probably 1 teaspoon. My cinnamon's almost gone. So as you guys saw, a little bit of it flopped out. You don't want to go too much cinnamon, so I'm not going to put a ton extra in there. But I also don't want to not have enough. So now just give it a toss. Try to mix it all up as much as possible. And right now it looks really dry, but as the apples kind of macerate, they will release some of their liquid in the bowl. And then that's when I'll determine how I'm going to add it to the pie shell. Okay. So that's what we're looking at right now. I'm going to set this to the side, get myself a new bowl out, and then I am going to set this on the thing because I'm going to have to cut the butter, so it could get a little bit loud. So the recipe calls for 1/3 cup of butter for the crumble topping. I do a whole cup because, again, I love butter and I want this to be rich and indulgent. I usually use unsalted, and then I'll just sprinkle in a little bit of salt. But I actually have a 1/2 stick of salted butter, so I'm just going to use that. And I'm just going to use the same knife that I used for the apples. There's no cross-contamination here because I am making the same thing. It's all going together. It's fine. So you're just going to cut it into little cubes. It's preferred that this butter be really cold. So the recipe says to sift together flour and sugar. I don't believe in sifting, so I'm not, but it's 3/4 cup of flour. And I normally use different measuring devices for sugar and flour, and I think I just used the sugar one, so, you know, probably not ideal. So there's my flour. And then, so that was 3/4 cup of flour. And then the recipe calls for 1/2 cup of sugar. Again, my grandma doesn't like things as sweet. So I'm going to do the 1/2 cup and then maybe another extra tablespoon. I don't try to go too heavy on the sugar here because I put a lot of extra sugar in the actual pie. She doesn't call for this, but I do just a little bit of cinnamon. Not a lot, probably enough where you don't even notice it's there. Like a 1/16 of a teaspoon. I don't know if you can see it in there. Just a very little bit on top. And then just stir it together. You can use a whisk. I'm just going to use this. It should be fine. And just make sure that sugar and stuff is well combined. Since I use salted butter, like I said, I'm not going to add any salt. But if I was going to use unsalted butter like I did on the first pie, I just sprinkle in maybe 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt, just because there's a lot of sweetness going on, so it does not hurt. Okay, so here is my butter, and I'm going to try to break it up just a little bit as I'm throwing it in there. And then I have my pastry cutter, and I just go in. I try to use a bowl that's older, that's not, you know, antique or special, because these pastry cutters can cause damage, obviously, scratching up the bowl. But I'm just going in and mashing the butter into the flour sugar mixture. And this probably takes about 2 or 3 minutes. And you want it to look like coarse crumbs. So you don't want a lot of just loose flour and or sugar. You want it all to have some sort of butter binder. And as you can see there, it's kind of like coarse crumbs, not a lot of loose flour. And I use a store-bought frozen crust, and it was frozen. I pulled it out while the oven was preheating, set it on the rack for like a minute, and it thaws it just enough where it's good to go. I baked this one a little bit longer, so it actually started to bake, but it should be fine. And then we're going to look at our apple mixture. As you can see, it's starting to get kind of moist. I don't want to add a lot of liquid, so I'm going to give it one really good stir and kind of evaluate. There's quite a bit of moisture, so I'm going to try to keep some of it in the pan. So as you can guess, now you just go and start dumping the apples on the pie. And then you just got to go in and kind of maneuver them in a way that works for the pie. So, make sure they're fairly even. Make sure all your apples aren't in one spot. I kind of push down on them to make sure there's no like big void. Like there was a void there because the whole apple slid down. Keep in mind while they're baking, your apples will also adjust. So now we take the topping very carefully. Go ahead and pour it over the top. And it feels like a lot, but let it fall down in the cracks because it bakes in with that apple filling. And boy, is it good. You get a piece that has some streusel down inside of it. So good. Guys, baking is a science. It's not a science, it's an art. It uses science, to be clear. But it's definitely an art form. So, one pie, you may use all of it. The next time you make this recipe, you may have a little bit extra. And I also try to keep the rim clean, and you'll see why here in a bit. So what I do is I take another baking sheet. These are just Dollar Tree cheap pizza pans. Transport it to a fresh one because I don't want to have to clean all that mess up. And then this is going to go in the middle rack of the oven for 15 minutes at 450. Okay, so that's going to go in the oven now as is for about 10 minutes at 450. At the 450 mark, we're going to lower the temperature to 350, and I'm going to place my favorite kitchen gadget, this Pampered Chef pie crust saver, on it. So I learned, and I was dumb, when I first got these, I would put it on when I'd put the pie crust in the oven, and when I would take it off, it would just tear the pie crust off, and I was mad. But I didn't read the instructions. You're supposed to let it partially bake and start to kind of finish on the top, and then you set this on top, and it keeps the crust from burning. I used to use foil, and it was a pain, so this is a good invention. Sometimes the streusel filling will kind of get around it, and you have to be careful when you pull it off. So while that's starting its prep, I'm going to start cleaning up. Okay, so I already took the ring off, but you kind of have to wiggle it because stuff will bake around it, so I had to do it while it was really hot. But it's been out for a few minutes now. I don't want it to slide around, but there it is in its beautiful glory. And now it will cool.